More now on religion and public policy through American history, including teaching religion in public school, the church and the social safety net, and how the president's faith affects his foreign policy agenda.
I'm delighted to see so many of you here. It's a really nice day, and you've all come in after lunch, and delighted to have you. I'm going to chair this session on religion and policy, and I've just stepped down as chair of the history department, so I can still be authoritarian, and I'm going to try and keep these speakers on time so that there's lots of time for all the questions I'm sure that you have about the fascinating issues they're going to raise today. This session, as I said, is on religion and policy, and we move a bit more from the theoretical to the practical as we look at the way the role of religion influences and has been influenced by policy decisions that range from teaching about religion in public schools to implementing American foreign policy. It's a great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, who is my friend and colleague, Professor Mark Chancey, Professor of Religious Studies at SMU. And even though I've known Mark for a long time, the chance to serve as moderator gave me a welcome opportunity to figure out what he's been doing all these years. Professor Chancey is a biblical studies scholar, and his most significant contributions to the field have changed the way we've understood Galilee at the time of Jesus Christ and shortly thereafter. His first book, The Myth of Gentile Galilee, published by Cambridge University Press in 2002, asserted that the overwhelming majority of Galilee's populations were Jews, and to do this study, he looked at the Gospels, the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, and published archaeological excavation reports. He used the same sources in his second book, The Greco-Roman Culture and the Galilee of Jesus, published also by Cambridge University Press in 2005, which challenged the conventional understanding of the culture of Galilee at the time. And he argued that the crucial change in Galilee's culture became Greco-Roman several centuries after the time that we had generally understood it to be the case, and only after the arrival of a large Roman garrison in the 2nd century. His paper today grows out of his more recent and very public involvement in the constitutional, political, and academic issues of religion and public school teaching. He's been on the front lines of critiquing the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills of Social Studies. He is also focused on the biblical studies curricula as they've been taught in the past in Dallas public schools, and as school systems are trying to implement them currently, most notably the Hobby Lobby curriculum that has been proposed for the Oklahoma public schools. Today, his topic, teaching all about religion in red state America, is something he has a lot of firsthand knowledge of. Our other three panelists are visitors to SMU, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome them here. I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, Professor Allison Collis Greene. She received her PhD in history from Yale University in 2010. She's currently an assistant professor at Mississippi State University, and she's also been selected as a fellow in the Young Scholars in American Religion cohort for 2013 to 15 by the Center for Religion and American Culture at Purdue University. Professor Greene has already identified several significant topics relating to religion and policy as the focus of her research on religion in the 20th century. Her first book, No Depression in Heaven, Economic Crisis and Religious Realignments in America's Alluvial Empire, is to be published by Oxford University Press. She uses the experiences of men and women in the Mississippi Delta and Arkansas as a specific focus to examine broader questions of how religious institutions responded to the Depression. Her study allows her to trace the changing appraisal of social and religious institutions by both lay people and clergy, as well as the shift from church-based charity to state-provided social services. Her second project takes on another historical topic with equally profound contemporary relevance. It's tentatively entitled God's Green Earth, Religion, Race, and the Environment Since the Gilded Age, which I'm sure you can understand will be extremely controversial. Today, she's going to address the interaction of church and state in the establishment of welfare in both the New Deal and the present. It's also a great pleasure to welcome our third speaker, Professor Jennifer Graber, who's an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Texas. Her work focuses primarily on the intersections of religion and violence, particularly in American prisons and in relation with Native Americans. Her first book, The Furnace of Affliction, Prisons and Religion in Antebellum America, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2011, explored the intersection of church and state during the founding of the nation's first prisons. She looked explicitly at evangelical Protestants' efforts to make religion central to emerging practices and philosophies about prison disciplines from 1790 through the 1850s. Initially, the idea of these evangelicals about inmate suffering and redemption were accepted. But later, over time, officials became less receptive, and as you might imagine, prisoners opposed some of them. Debates about religion in prison had much broader ramifications for issues of church-state separation. And ultimately, Professor Graber is able to show how Protestant reformers failed to convert large numbers of inmates or to make prisons reflect their values. Instead, they adopted the secular ideas about American morals and virtues and citizens so that they no longer saw inmates' afflictions as a necessary prelude to grace, but rather the required punishment for breaking the nation's laws. Professor Graber has another project underway which focuses on religious transformations in Indian and settler communities who settle in the area that is now southwest Oklahoma. Today's paper returns to a particular application of religion and violence in Drone War to Indian War, Protecting and Liberating Innocent Women and Children. It's a change of title or an elaboration of title from your program. It's also a great pleasure to welcome the final speaker of this panel, Professor Andrew Preston, who's perhaps traveled the furthest to be with us today. He teaches American history at Cambridge University, where he's a fellow of Clare College. He's an expert on American diplomatic history. He has numerous scholarly publications in that area, including The War Council, McGeorge Bundy, the NCS and Vietnam, published by Harvard University Press in 2006, Nixon in the World, U.S. Foreign Relations 1969 to 77, which he edited with Frederick Longueval, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, as well as America in the World, A History and Documents from the War with Spain to the War on Terror, published by Princeton in 2014, which he edited with both Mark Atwood Lawrence and our very own Jeffrey Engel. Professor Preston has also focused on religion and American foreign affairs, most notably in his book, Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy, which was published by Knopf in 2012. This book tells the story of how America's role in the world has been shaped by their belief that God had a special place for the United States. Professor Preston explored a wide variety of strains of religious fervor, from liberal to conservative, pacifist to militant, internationalist and isolationist, looking at American international issues from the colonial wars to the 21st century. The style and substance of this important work were recognized when Professor Preston received the Charles Taylor Prize in 2013 for the best Canadian work of literary nonfiction. I think all of us academic writers are really jealous of that particular award. Today, Professor Preston addresses America's mission in the age of Obama. So look forward to all of that. Thank you.
Now that Kathleen has offered such a gracious introduction to our session, I'll begin my talk with a quotation from Kathleen Wellman. Appearing before the Texas State Board of Education about 6 weeks ago, Professor Wellman warned of flaws in the social studies textbook that the State Board was reviewing. These books make Moses the original founding father and credit him for virtually every distinctive feature of American government, she observed. Some texts were so skewed, she lamented, that students might even end up, quote, believing that Moses was the first American, an erroneous conclusion in Wellman's estimation. If Moses is startlingly prominent in these textbooks, it is because the textbooks were written to cover social studies standards created by the Texas Board of Education in 2009 and 2010. These standards depict Moses as someone, quote, whose principles informed the American founding documents. They portray the Ten Commandments as a direct precursor to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They identify biblical law and the Judeo-Christian legal tradition as the starting points for American law and government. This is what Texas wants its students to know about Moses and the Ten Commandments. Social studies traditionally has a civic function. Its purpose is to cultivate the knowledge, skills, and virtues necessary for responsible citizenship. Thus, what social studies standards say about religion functionally represents the minimal knowledge about religion that the state wants its citizens to have. And what the standards say about religion is determined through a political process. Now, Texas is one of the few states to have a board of education elected through partisan elections. So what the standards say is determined by a partisan process. Democrats and Republicans vie against each other to shape their content, and factions within each party vie against each other, such as Tea Party Republicans and moderate Republicans. The board is dominated by Republicans. The standards were formed by a Republican-dominated board, and to some observers, the current social studies standards reflect an attempt to teach students to look at religion through a lens colored with particular red state sensibilities. To illustrate what I mean by this, I'll first summarize how these current standards, formulated in 2010, treat religion, especially religion in America and the so-called world religions. I'll then put the current standards into historical perspective by investigating what previous state educational guidelines have said about religion and social studies. Because of the sheer size of Texas's textbook market, publishers have traditionally been very eager to develop products that appeal to the state's specifications, and content from Texas textbooks has made its way into editions used elsewhere. So, the Texas State Board of Education affects what students learn across the country. The Texas curricular standards are known as TEKS, T-E-K-S, for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, TEKS. The current TEKS are a revision of the 1998 TEKS, which themselves often referred to religion. But most of the 1998 references to religion were general in nature, whereas many of those in the current TEKS, the 2010 TEKS, have very specific agendas behind them. The most obvious example of this with the current TEKS is their portrayal of the Bible as the wellspring of American political thought. This is a signature belief of an ideology that I call Christian Americanism, an ideology that believes that America's founders intended it to be a distinctively Christian nation, that America has drifted from its Christian heritage, and that it is a patriotic and religious duty to return the country to its true Christian identity. And here I refer you back to Kate Cartier-Engel's paper this morning on the founders. When the 15-member board created the current TEKS in 2009 and 2010, 7 of its 10 Republican members, including the board chair, worked very hard to work this ideology into the social studies standards. And they were usually able to pick up the extra vote that they needed to get an 8-person majority. They could get it from the other 3 Republicans or even occasionally from one of the Democrats. This 7-member bloc devoted to this ideology regularly presented Christian Americanist arguments as indisputable historical facts. They did it in the board meetings, they did it in public speeches, they did it in their writings, they did it in their comments to journalists. They appointed amateur historians, famous for these views, as the board's experts to tell the board what students should learn about American history. And here I refer again to the paper earlier this morning, the discussions of David Barton and Peter Marshall, amateur historians who were the board's appointed experts. The transparency of this Christian Americanist agenda is illustrated by board member Cynthia Dunbar's prayer at the May 21st, 2010 board meeting. "I believe," she prayed, "no one can read the history of our country without realizing that the good book and the spirit of the Savior have from the beginning been our guiding geniuses. Whether we look to the first charter of Virginia, or the charter of New England, or the charter of Massachusetts Bay, or the fundamental orders of Connecticut, the same objective is present: a Christian land governed by Christian principles. I believe the entire Bill of Rights came into being because of the knowledge our forefathers had of the Bible and their belief in it. I like to believe we are living today in the spirit of the Christian religion." Now, in the context of board politics, this was a very provocative prayer. What is ironic about it is that it was not her own composition. In fact, she was quoting a prayer by none other than Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court justice who had presided over the Warren Court, who had issued the decisions prohibiting school-sponsored Bible reading and prayer in public schools. Even this hero of church-state separationism, she implied, really believed deep down that the United States was a Christian nation. Now, I would note that Justice Warren offered the prayer not at a governmental function, but at a private prayer breakfast, in contrast to Dunbar, who offered it at a state board of education meeting. I tell this anecdote because I think it illustrates just how transparent and obvious this political and religious agenda was, even at the time. And the bloc with this agenda was very successful in raising Christianity's profile in American history and government TEKS. They added references to the standards to religious revivals, to Phyllis Schlafly, the moral majority, Billy Graham. They put in a new standard on the, quote, meaning and historical significance of the motto, "In God We Trust." They inserted into a standard formerly devoted to the Enlightenment references to Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin. One of their most contested additions was the creation of a new high school standard requiring students to, quote, examine the reasons the Founding Fathers protected religious freedom in America and guaranteed its free exercise by saying that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And compare and contrast this to the phrase separation of church and state. The standard sponsors very, very clearly intended their standard to suggest that the founders never envisioned separation of church and state. Conservative members also highlighted the religious motives of the earliest English colonists, especially the Puritans, and they inserted into the TEKS the names of individuals from the founding era who were lauded as paragons of piety. And so there are tons of names in the standards who might be worthy of study for any number of reasons, but the reason that they're there is because they once said something nice about Jesus. Traditions other than Christianity received more attention in the 2010 TEKS than they had in the 1998 TEKS, though still not as much as Christianity. Christianity in the current standards is the only religious tradition that the TEKS explicitly acknowledge as internally diverse. So students learn about Protestants, Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox Christians, but they do not necessarily learn about differences within any other tradition. In general, in the TEKS, religions originating in Asia receive very little explicit consideration. There were two earlier standards on so-called world religions. They're still there that require study of Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. They now also include Sikhism, a reflection of the successful lobbying effort of the Texas Sikh community. One new standard focuses on Muslim-Hindu relations in South Asia. Another new standard on Jewish, Christian, and Muslim contact in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Judaism also is highlighted in references to the Holocaust, the nation of Israel, Jewish holidays, the origins of monotheism, and, of course, to references to America's purported biblical roots. Islam is the subject of several new TEKS, some of which refer to Islamic history, and some of which are contemporary in focus. In general, the contemporary TEKS about Islam associate it with terrorism. The most explicit link, quote, radical Islamic fundamentalism to, quote, Palestinian terrorism, the growth of Al-Qaeda, and 9/11. One standard attributes responsibility for, quote, ongoing conflict with Israel solely to Arab rejection of Israel. That standard does not technically refer to Islam, but has obvious conceptual kinship to those that do. The overall impression the TEKS give is that the most salient feature of contemporary Islam is its association with terrorism, conflict, and hostility to Israel. As an aside, I would note that the board rejected a motion by two Democrats to add a standard to the TEKS on, quote, other acts of terrorism prior to September 11, 2001, not related to Islam, including the U.S. cavalry against American Indians, the Texas Rangers against Mexican Americans, and for decades by the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups right here in our own country. For some reason, that did not end up in the official state standards. How does the place of religion in these present TEKS compare to religion in previous social studies guidelines? To find out, I worked through 99 years worth of state educational documents. I went back as early as I could go. They were of different genres. Their guidelines were sometimes suggestions, sometimes mandatory. They came from different offices and agencies, but they contained enough information to allow some general comparison, and it was very interesting. What did I discover? You sometimes hear the idea that religion was once prevalent in the social studies curriculum and that somehow it has been taken out. And I would suggest this is really not the case. Historically, in Texas, what has happened is that religion has been addressed almost exclusively in world history classes, which have generally been Western religion classes. It's been very much focused on Christian encounters with the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism as a predecessor to Christianity, Islam as a competitor to Christianity from the medieval period onwards, and that's it. Asian religions typically have barely appeared, except in discussions of British colonialism. The only real exception to this is a 1957 Cold War-era guide for social studies that very much emphasizes that religion is at the heart of American identity. And I think those nostalgic for a time when textbooks and curricula promoted religion for social studies are remembering the years of the Cold War. It's the only time it ever showed up in Texas standards. In 1998, Reformulated standards included general references to religion, discover the contributions of various religious, ethnic, and national groups to American identity. These general references. But we had none of the specific references that we find today to America's Christian roots, and particularly none demonizing Islam as the other. In the 21st century, in a time of changing religious and ethnic demographics in America, at a time of uncertainty regarding conflict around the world, when Islam often seems to be interpreted only as the other, the stakes seem high indeed for those determining what public schools will teach about religion and what sense of American identity social studies classes will convey. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Allison Greene. I teach at Mississippi State University. My paper is titled The Welfare of Faith, but I think I could also call it Some Things Texas Does Not Want Its Students to Know About Religion and U.S. History. So when Barack Obama took office in 2009, supporters celebrated his inaugural addresses, quote, echoes of Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. And they hoped especially that he would emulate the latter of those. Franklin Roosevelt also ousted a Republican opponent in the midst of economic crisis, the bleakest one of the 20th century, and in the face of worldwide instability. Yet in 1933, Americans clamored for the federal government to intervene in the suffering they faced. From left to the right, religious leaders celebrated the handoff of social welfare from the church to the state, and they heralded the New Deal as the realization of their own reform efforts. 76 years later, when Obama took office, religious organizations instead operated as private administrators of public welfare funds. They had relied on federal support for international relief and anti-poverty efforts since the 1950s. After Bill Clinton signed off on the charitable choice provision to his 1996 welfare reforms, religious organizations claimed an even more direct role in public welfare. By the time of Obama's inauguration, Christian organizations simultaneously controlled and denounced federal support for those in need. Now, contemporary arguments about the relative effectiveness of federal and voluntary aid agencies tend to build on two contradictory historical narratives, both of which take the New Deal as a turning point. Advocates on the one hand of a privatized state stress the New Deal, the pre-New Deal power of charitable institutions to care for the needy. In 2012, Franklin Graham, head of Samaritan's Purse, itself an evangelical agency that's drawn heavily on federal funds for its international aid work, voiced a popular expression of this position. In an interview with ABC's Christiane Amanpour, Graham explained, 100 years ago, the safety net, the social safety net in the country was provided by the church, but the government took that and took it away from the church. So by Graham's narrative, this isn't just, the churches didn't just lose a public role in charity, but they also lost the moral authority to cultivate good citizens by tying aid to prescribed behaviors. On the other hand, scholars and activists who defend the welfare state, even as they seek to redress its inequities, tell a very different story in which the churches play very little part. Scholars of poverty and welfare stress the much longer history of public aid from the mid-19th century forward. Yet those public agencies built on private charities' work and on their racialized and gendered notions that some poor deserved help and some poor did not. The New Deal wove those inequities into a safety net that disproportionately benefited white men, even as it forced women and minorities to submit to means tests when it covered them at all. For many scholars and activists, then, the appropriate redress for the New Deal's injustices is not to dismantle or privatize welfare, but to restructure it on a more equitable model. The divide between these two narratives is clear. Advocates of voluntarism point to private organizations' illustrious history in caring for those in need. Advocates of a federal safety net point to the necessary and long-standing role of state and public agencies in individual welfare. But both camps focus almost entirely historically on the urban north and west, where both private and public agencies proved most powerful. So basically, both parties focus on the very best historical version of their preferred models. So what I want to ask today is, what about the places where people relied almost entirely on a very limited scope of voluntary, largely church-based aid, all the way up to 1933. What kind of help did those agencies offer? Who did they offer it to, and under what conditions? How did they fund that work? How did they navigate the greatest economic crisis since the Civil War? And how did their work change in response to the New Deal and in its aftermath? I'm going to use as my example today Memphis, Tennessee, and the surrounding Delta regions of Mississippi and Arkansas, in part because that's where I focus my work, and also because it's a region that provides a really interesting set of answers to these questions. Both the city and the countryside relied almost entirely on voluntary aid until the 1930s. By that time, Memphis was a city of 250,000 people, a majority of them white, but 38% of them African American. The Delta, most parts of the Delta, were majority black. The region thus provides some insight into the distinct forms of aid available to black and white Southerners in a Jim Crow order. Private charities, most of them religious, accounted for 76% of relief expenditures in Memphis in 1930, and for nearly 100% in the Delta. Between the Civil War and the Great Depression, white Protestant women's societies and home missions organizations built schools, hospital, orphanages, and settlement houses to reach needy whites, but they served only those that they deemed deserving and appropriately deferent. Concerned that their members not be deemed a burden on the larger Protestant community, Catholic and Jewish charities served members of their own communities, and sometimes also reached people beyond those communities. Black churches, women's societies, and fraternal orders provided the only source of support for most African Americans in need, and they established schools, medical facilities, and insurance programs in both the city and the countryside. Yet the need that these organizations sought to alleviate outpaced the resources that they could gather even before the Depression. And then disaster struck. It struck early in Memphis and the Delta. A record-setting drought in the spring and summer of 1930 parched the cotton in the fields as the prices for what little remained plummeted to a third of the previous year's rates. And this is a region that depended almost entirely on cotton. Food crops shriveled even before the cotton, which is actually a relatively drought-resistant crop. A wave of bank failures swept the region, and even people who had managed to put by a little money saw their savings disappear. Reports soon emerged of people walking. The Red Cross steps in and eventually provides emergency aid after a lot of wrangling on the part of local politicians in Mississippi. And soon reporters travel to the region and they talk about women walking miles for food, their feet wrapped in sacks, begging for medical aid for babies dying of malnutrition. And there are stories that emerge from the region of children lying under trees and dying before aid can come to them. So when people tell you that the Depression didn't hurt in rural places or that no one was starving in America, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. So private aid organizations faced three crises at once. First, the number of people who needed help skyrocketed. Second, the defense that many of the poor deserved their lot fell apart in the face of widespread crisis. And last, donations to charities and churches plummeted while any savings that they had vanished in the same bank failures that crushed farmers and the middle class. Churches and charities tried to help. In December of 1929, Memphis's Salvation Army, the largest charity in the city, had served 1,700 meals. A year later, in 1930, in December, that number ballooned to 6,500 meals. By April of 1930, the Salvation Army served more than 10,000 meals, which was 10 times more than 1 year previous. The Salvation Army was also a shelter for men, and it drained its swimming pool to make room for men to sleep on the pool floor. While the Salvation Army expanded, most other charities and aid organizations cut back. Women's clubs, fraternal orders, and other quasi-religious private organizations suspended their work or disbanded altogether. And churches fared worse. Many of them struggled just to keep their doors open. Between 1929 and 1932, national income dropped by more than 50%. Now, until 1933, church giving actually held steady as a proportion of national income, but we're still talking about a 50% loss, which proved crippling at the very moment that demands on church resources escalated. Still more ominously, the churches cut benevolent spending first. The president of the cash-strapped Southern Baptist Convention explained in 1931, "We're putting off the Lord's cause while we try to settle with our other creditors." And that was a fairly common sentiment. When the money ran out, the churches turned their spending inward, not outward. As they faced the suffering before them and their own inability to alleviate it, even conservative religious leaders joined social workers and hungry Americans to call for the federal government to step in. The barrage of legislation that Franklin Roosevelt signed in his first 100 days in 1933 included a program that drew a clear line between federal and private relief, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FARA. FARA replaced Herbert Hoover's Reconstruction Finance Corporation loans with grants to the states for relief projects. Headed by an Iowan, Harry Hopkins, FARA was the first program to put federal funds not only toward employment relief, but also toward direct aid for the suffering administered at both the state and local level. It was also the program that most directly engaged with work once conducted by private aid organizations. In June of 1933, Hopkins stipulated that as of July 1st, only public agencies could administer FARA funds. Now, in practice, leaders of private and religious agencies often transition to public positions, and many private agencies, including all of Catholic Charities in Chicago, for instance, gained public certification. Still, Hopkins' decree established a clear boundary between the public and the private realms, both for FARA and for subsequent New Deal programs. The public had one job, the private another. As significant as that boundary was the vastly larger pool of resources the federal government could leverage. Again, I'll use Memphis as an example. At the peak of private giving in 1931, Memphians raised a total of 88 cents per person in aid dollars. 75 cents, or 85% of that, was private. 3 years later, by 1934, with the New Deal in full swing, Memphians received $7.21 per capita in aid, but private contributions amounted to only 13 cents per capita, 1.6% of the total. So that's a swing from 85% private aid to 98% public aid over the course of 3 years. The swing is easier to track in the city where there's data, but it was even more pronounced in the countryside and then the Delta where public aid had scarcely existed at all and starvation remained commonplace. Because it was the only New Deal agency to provide direct aid to the needy, FARA proved especially important to religious leaders. People had finally begun to receive the help that they so desperately needed and that churches and civic organizations had proven unable to provide. But now those people began to turn to the state rather than to local religious groups for both material aid and personal guidance. But even FARA was a temporary measure intended only to meet the immediate physical needs of people devastated by the Depression. The program expired in 1935, replaced in part by two programs at the heart of the second New Deal, the Works Progress Administration and the Social Security Act. Maybe because these two programs created permanent structures that overlapped with work the churches had once done, in September of 1935, as they were enacted, Roosevelt's administration sent a letter to the nation's clergy asking what they thought, particularly of these two programs, and he received more than 12,000 replies within 2 months. A full 84% of those replies proved generally favorable in tone, particularly towards the Social Security Act, which made provisions for the elderly, the orphaned, and the disabled. The editor of the South's major white Methodist journal wrote, "Above all else, as I see it, is your Social Security program. For the first time in our history, we have a national administration that is seeking to realize practically all the objectives of the social creed of the churches, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews." For religious leaders like this one, the welfare state represented a religious achievement, not an encroachment on the church's work. Indeed, it freed the churches to focus on supplementary work or to refocus on evangelism. A few clergy, however, began to express concerns that would grow more widespread by the late 30s, especially among conservative white Protestants. One Mississippi Presbyterian and self-proclaimed Southern Democrat worried that the state had severed the church's hold on community members who now had someplace else to go when they wanted help. Where they once had community contacts for cooperation and sympathy, he lamented, they now look to the government for everything. Now, it's possible that federal aid made it easier for some poor families to disconnect from middle-class churches where they felt out of place. Now they had options other than local paternalism, and clergy already inclined to question the New Deal expressed alarm and outrage. So although dissent against the New Deal grew during the late 1930s, Roosevelt's programs remained enormously popular in the region and its churches for decades afterward. Black and white workers proved loyal to the president that they credited with pulling them out of the Depression, as did much of the region's middle class. The South's Republican turn lay in the future. The memory of the inadequacy of private relief and its utter collapse in a moment of crisis, still fresh, Southerners in the 30s and 40s embraced the nascent welfare state. But soon American religious institutions began to take roles not only complementary to the welfare state, but in fact integral to it and funded by it. After World War II, secular and religious nonprofits worked as subsidiaries of the federal government to provide overseas relief. As the domestic welfare state expanded under both Republican and Democratic presidents from the 40s to the 60s, federal officials relied on private subsidiaries, including religious organizations, to administer new programs. As conservative critics of the welfare state rose to power in the 80s and 90s, they pushed further privatization of services. But it was Democrat Bill Clinton, as I mentioned at the beginning, who signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act into law in 1996, and with it charitable choice, a provision that ensured that religious providers receive equal consideration and competition for federal funds. His successor, George W. Bush, established the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, which allowed churches and not just religious charities to receive federal funds. So as the welfare state shrank, an increasing proportion of its remaining funds went to explicitly religious providers. More than 80 years since the New Deal first established a federal safety net, it's still hard to imagine the United States without such basic protections for its citizens. But many conservatives and libertarians call for just that, recalling an American past that never existed, in which unfettered capitalism ensured a robust economy, and in which the deserving poor received what they needed from generous private charities. I'm not sure where that money came from. Yet those very charities have become so deeply entwined in the federal government in the post-World War II decades that in dismantling the welfare state, they now also risk dismantling themselves. Thanks.
Good afternoon. In November 2001, First Lady Laura Bush offered the Presidential Weekly Radio Address. She invited listeners to a worldwide effort to eliminate brutality against women and children. She focused her remarks on Afghanistan. She claimed that all people of goodwill, including many Muslims, deplored Taliban treatment of women and girls. Mothers could not leave their homes unaccompanied and suffered beatings for laughing out loud. Girls could not attend school. Women had their fingernails pulled out if they dared wear nail polish. While Mrs. Bush highlighted the situation in Afghanistan, she compared women's status under the Taliban to places across the globe affected by the al-Qaeda terrorist network. The First Lady's impulse to protect foreign women and children has a long history in the United States. Since the founding era, Americans have decried rumors of infanticide and foot binding in China, widow burning in India, harems in the Middle East, and abandoned orphans in Central America. They have also expressed concern for foreigners within U.S. boundaries, including Native American women in nomadic encampments and immigrant children working in urban factories. For more than 2 centuries, Americans have argued that foreign women and children demand not only our attention and sympathy, but also saving action. Literary critic Amy Kaplan has called this saving impulse imperial domesticity. In her study of antebellum home manuals, Kaplan found that female writers focused on problems besetting women and children around the world. These writers then offered civilizing visions of domestic life to savages in both the U.S. and abroad. Today, I'd like to consider the operations of imperial domesticity, particularly in times of war. Mrs. Bush's remarks interest me not only as a statement about proper domestic organization, but also as an example of wartime rhetoric. She offered her radio address as the U.S. initiated a bombing campaign in Afghanistan and followed it with a ground invasion that drove the Taliban from power. The U.S. was at war with a country populated by women Americans longed to save. Because women and children are typically considered non-combatants during conflicts, both supporters and opponents of various wars have argued for protecting them from harm. At the same time, the discourse of imperial domesticity affirms that foreign women and children lead terrible lives and require liberation from their male relations and religious cultures. American religious leaders and representatives, who often invest both warfare and the nation's regard for women and children with moral meaning, have played an important role in blurring the lines between calls for protection and projects of liberation. I want to explore this rhetorical pattern in two historical situations: the 19th century Indian Wars and the present-day War on Terror. Religious leaders and writers, perhaps unconsciously, obscure the difference between protection and liberation in ways that classify Native American and Muslim women and children as innocents requiring deliverance, often by violent means, from their hostile, extremist, and terrorist male relations. In November 1864, Colonel John Chivington led his Colorado militia to the edges of an Indian encampment. In one of the most infamous attacks by American armed forces on an unsuspecting Indian community, his men killed scores of women, children, and elderly members of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. In defense of his battle, Chivington testified that he had punished Indians who resisted American authority and had attacked innocent white people. He also suggested that his soldiers killed but few women and children. Some of the men in Chivington's command disagreed. One militia captain offered gruesome details about the Sand Creek attack. Quote, "I was present at a massacre of 300 of Indians, mostly women and children. It was a horrible scene, and I would not let my company fire." Other soldiers, however, did fire. The dissenting captain recalled in a letter to his mother, "It looked too hard for me to see little children on their knees begging for their lives, to have their brains beat out like dogs." This was 1864, late in the American Civil War, and not long after a Union Army order that established criteria for inflicting violence against civilians. In 1862, President Lincoln commissioned a new code of war conduct, often called Lieber's Code, just as the Union was about to initiate hard war against the Confederacy. The code included a section on non-combatants. The code affirmed that advances in civilization required the distinction between private individuals belonging to a hostile country and the hostile country itself, with its men in arms. While establishing the priority of protecting civilians, Lieber's Code also included a clause about military necessity. Sometimes securing the ends of war sometimes demanded only targeting not only armed enemies, but also other persons whose destruction is incidentally unavoidable. While Lieber's Code certainly shaped Union engagements in the South, historians debate its impact in Indian country. Most Americans did not concede that Indians were legitimate combatants. They also viewed Indians as racial and cultural others. Military officials argued that Indians' style of warfare and their nomadic encampments made it difficult to defeat them. Officials invoked the doctrine of military necessity to authorize devastating attacks on entire villages, which often caused high rates of women and children casualties. Even so, protocols for citizen protection as detailed in the civilian protection, as detailed in the Lieber Code, reflected the ambivalence many Americans felt about attacks that harmed women and children. Responses to Sand Creek revealed the strength of those convictions. Within days of the attack, critics from across the political spectrum condemned General Chivington. Leaders of the Christian organizations, as well as journalists for religious periodicals, added their voices to a rising tide of condemnation. When Colorado's governor published a report claiming that troops had indiscriminately slaughtered Indians, a Presbyterian paper out of New York reprinted it under the headline, "Indians Murdered by Our Troops, National Sins That Demand Punishment." The author called the massacre a disgraceful act unfit for the age we live in. Over the next decades, Sand Creek came to symbolize American assaults on Indian women and children. To be sure, anti-Indian writers countered with stories of Indian attacks on American innocents. Religious leaders acknowledged these attacks, but typically attributed them to failed federal Indian policies and brutal actions by overland immigrants. This willingness to condemn U.S. offenses while contextualizing Indian ones reflected many Americans' sense that they, unlike Native Americans, were civilized enough to refrain from killing innocent bystanders. In this way, determining moral forms of warfare figured in Americans' classification of civilization and savagery. So did domestic ideals and gender norms. In this period, Americans circulated a variety of images of indigenous women, from the helpful Pocahontas to the promiscuous squaw. They also envisioned Indian women as domestic slaves to their lazy, despotic husbands. Stories of overworked Indian wives confirmed Americans' notions that Native women longed for freedom from their savage husbands. In the 19th century, writers in the religious press focused on Indian women as they articulated concerns about innocent noncombatants, at the same time that they also argued for the transformation of Indian domestic life. These writers identified Indian women as quintessentially friendly because they did not associate these women with armed resistance. They assumed that Indian women would form new kinds of marriages once freed from Indian men's domination. Outcry over civilian casualties at Sand Creek focused on difficult questions about civilian casualties, but relied on the tropes of imperial domesticity that categorized Indian women as a particular kind of innocent. Similar to the Indian Wars, outcry over President Obama's expanded drone program includes imperial domesticity's rhetoric of protecting and liberating foreign women. Critics of the drone program point to high numbers of civilian casualties, despite the weapon's reputation for precision targeting. Religious leaders and writers in the religious press also criticize high civilian casualty rates, invoking law of war principles as well as just war theory to argue that the drone program must be radically altered, if not ended altogether. Contemporary law of war includes regulations for wartime conduct. It provides for distinction, directing belligerents to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Like his predecessor, President Obama has invoked law of war principles in his discussion of the war on terror generally and drone policy specifically. Anticipating the possibility that strikes might harm noncombatants, administration officials have stated it would not be consistent with the law of war to continue an operation if anticipated civilian casualties would be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage. Law of war principles overlap with the centuries-old Christian tradition of just war theory. The 4th century theologian Augustine articulated some of these principles, which Dominican theologian Thomas Aquinas systematized in the 13th century. Christian theologians eventually settled on 2 sets of principles: criterion for going to war and measures for wartime conduct. Several just war criteria, including necessity, distinction, proportionality, eventually were accepted by the international community as part of the law of war. In his public discussion of drones, President Obama has evoked language from the just war tradition. He has insisted that drone strikes can be undertaken only if there is near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured. Obama has also acknowledged civilian deaths due to American drone strikes. He calls these losses haunting, but that they were also necessary if the U.S. was to reduce civilian casualties that would result if terrorist networks operated without restriction. The use of drones in the war on terror, Obama has declared, is part of a, quote, just war, a war waged proportionally, in last resort, and in self-defense. Critics have regularly sounded their displeasure with Obama's drone policy and have featured periodically in news cycles stretching from 2009 to 2014. Major news outlets have included bloody descriptions of women and children harmed by drones. Religious leaders and writers in the religious press have employed just war language to express their concerns. For instance, in a 2013 anti-drone video publicized by Alternet and CNN's BeliefNet, Christian and Jewish leaders criticized Obama and claimed that drones violated just war principles of necessity, proportionality, and distinction. Several religious bodies, ranging from the National Conference of Catholic Bishops to the Moderate Disciples of Christ to the National Black Church Initiative, have also publicized their dissent. Even religious and writers and leaders who have expressed support for the war on terror, such as columnists in First Things, have criticized Obama's drone policy for its failures to distinguish between combatants and civilians. As in other times of conflict, conversations about civilized forms of warfare parallel commentary on the enemy's domestic patterns. Since the beginning of the war on terror, Americans have claimed that Afghani women need not only protection from war, but liberation from their husbands and their religious leaders. The burqa, or full body and face veil required by the Taliban, has particularly occupied Americans' imaginations. Indeed, in 2001, President George Bush declared his, quote, friendship and support for Afghanistan's women of cover. American religious commentators have not been among those most strident critics of the burqa. In fact, the debate as it has played out in U.S. religious publications has been surprisingly nuanced on the question of Muslim women's dress. A Roundtable in Christianity Today, a kind of evangelical publication, is a typical case. Commenters emphasize the need to listen to Muslim women about their veiling choices. But at the same time, the commenters questioned whether Islam actually requires veiling. By questioning the Quranic interpretations of presumably male leaders, these American Christians expressed their concern about forced veiling without criticizing the women themselves or Islam as a religion. Muslim men, it seems, are the problem. Concerns about imposition by male religious leaders can be found in many Christian periodicals, including a Christianity Today feature about an American female fighter pilot who refused to follow U.S. Army stipulations to wear an abaya while off base in Saudi Arabia. In articles about veiling, these writers express their deeper concern over Muslim women's freedom and choices. As religious studies scholar Saba Mahmood has observed, Westerners presume that religious agency requires independence and freedom. They conclude that Muslim women share this conception of agency, but are connected to men who restrict their freedom. Reflecting these assumptions about Muslim women's desire to be free religious agents, Christian periodicals, a wide-ranging set of them, highlight Muslim women engaged in activities that Americans view as independent and free. Articles feature Muslim women who run modeling agencies and train for the Olympics. My favorite is a Sojourner's piece about a Pakistani television show called Burqa Avenger. In it, a school teacher by day dons a tight black burqa along with black nail polish at night and fights for women's education. These articles celebrate vision who value American notions of beauty, freedom, bodily expression, and independence. Depictions of foreign women as both living under male constraints but desiring liberation and freedom to live out American notions of womanhood have a long history. 21st century celebrations of Burqa Avenger have a precedent in the 19th century missionary pamphlets about Indian women who haven't met yet their domestic potential. While scholars have identified this trend in many forms of literature, my sense is that this rhetoric is especially pronounced in times of war. This intensification of imperial domesticity matters because these gendered visions shape conversations about who is friendly and hostile, about who is a good Muslim and who is bad. Religious leaders and writers in the religious press take for granted that foreign women and children desire liberation from the familial and cultural bonds that ensnare them. If they weren't forced to veil, they wouldn't. If they were allowed to wear nail polish, they would. At the very least, the sentiments at the heart of imperial domesticity have unconsciously shaped arguments for protecting innocent civilians from war's destruction. I would argue that, at times, these sentiments have also kept Americans from recognizing the kinds of damage that American attacks have done to foreign women and children, even if their bodies have been spared. Afghani women and children have lost many things they hold dear. Bombs have devastated their beloved lands. Too many family members have died violently. Their country has been thrown into a period of turmoil. In times of war, imperial domesticity compels us to focus on the potential for gendered transformation and shifts our gaze away from the tragedies of war. By linking the work of protection with visions of liberation, Americans can avoid reckoning with the violence women and children experience when the men, the communities, and the landscapes they love are deemed legitimate targets for death and destruction. Thank you.
My thanks to Darren and Matt for putting on this conference and for inviting me. I think Matt actually deserves the prize for the person who has come furthest, given that he's in Germany this year. Normally I would win that prize, at least when I come to conferences in the United States, but this time I think I have to cede that prize to Matt. So thanks for the invitation, thanks for putting on this conference, and thanks to Jeff and his staff for putting on so far what's a wonderful event, and thanks for your hospitality and your hard work in putting this all together. My topic today is the religious influence on American foreign policy. Excuse me. And especially religion's role in providing a sense of purpose, a soul, if you will, for American foreign policy. And so it's no surprise that two of the major sub-themes that I'm going to be touching on here are religious pluralism and religious freedom. And it struck me, listening to the papers so far, that those two themes, religious pluralism, religious freedom, keep popping up again and again on That's my water, right? Okay, good, thanks. Keep popping up again and again through, not just in my paper, but in a lot of the other papers. And in fact, as Kathleen said, I did change my title, where now I'm discussing America's mission, not just faith in Obama's foreign policy, but America's mission in the world and how that's changing in the age of Obama. And what I argue essentially in the paper is that today we're at a key crossroads where a powerful source of ideas, values, and ideology, that is religion, in American foreign policy is changing. Obviously, in making that argument, I'm making myself a hostage to fortune. In the book that Kathleen mentioned that I wrote on religion in U.S. foreign policy from the colonial era to the present, I finished with an epilogue that discussed very briefly George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and I didn't really want to say very much about either of them because I didn't want to make this work of history a hostage to fortune. But even the very brief things that I said about Obama in 2 pages in that epilogue are now hopelessly out of date. But nonetheless, I'm going to try again and more or less argue with myself. Traditionally, there have been 2 basic sources, very basic sources, of the religious influence. And they're basic, but they're still, in my field, my main field of diplomatic history, the U.S. and the world, they're still, they're quite controversial. The first source of the religious influence on American foreign policy is top-down. It should be fairly obvious just in saying top-down. It's the personal faith of presidents, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, and others, and how they bring that personal faith to bear on their foreign policy. And we can all, as I'm saying that, I'm sure a lot of you are instantly sort of doing a laundry list of demonstrably, very famously, religious presidents and secretaries of state, people like William McKinley, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, Ronald Reagan, and others. But this top-down influence could also be rooted in political calculation. And here I would use Richard Nixon as an example of someone who invoked religion quite a bit, not as frequently as someone like Eisenhower or Truman or George W. Bush, but did so mostly for political calculation. And we can tell that because the private record just doesn't match up to his political statements. So that's the first, the top-down influence. The second is a bottom-up. Obviously, it's the opposite of a top-down influence. That's a bottom-up influence of people who I've called ordinary Americans who bring a tremendous amount of pressure to bear on foreign policy. Even when politicians and policymakers have wanted to ignore religion, they found it difficult to do so because of this relentless pressure from below, from a wide variety of religious groups and religious actors, groups that are comprised of very highly motivated people who don't wield power or hold political office, but who are emphasizing the importance of values in. Hi guys, come on in, find a seat somewhere. There are lots of. Unsurprisingly, there are lots of seats towards the front. I won't bite, and I also won't single you out again. I promise. And the goals of these, ordinary Americans, these people who actually didn't wield political power, were often, but not always, tied to religious freedom, to the religious freedom of their co-religionists abroad. And a prominent example, it's one I've done a lot of work on, is the fate of Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia and later the Soviet Union, a story that runs more or less continually from the 1880s to the 1970s, and did bring about a real change in actual policy. This is an example which I can use in diplomatic history circles where people want, where historians want, a very clear, empirically based case of a direct impact of cause and effect of something like religion on U.S. foreign policy, and I can use the example of this pressure to protect and promote the religious freedom of Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia and the Soviet Union. That did bring about a change in U.S. foreign policy, despite what policymakers themselves wanted or did not want. So I would argue that the religious influence in American foreign policy has always been there, but its strength and pervasiveness is mostly a 20th century phenomenon. It pre-existed the 20th century, but as a consistent force in America's mission in the world, it's really something that dates from 1898-99. And I would say it's not a coincidence that religion became prominent in the 20th century when the United States became a global power, but for the most part was rarely itself under threat of attack, and so needed a powerful moral justification or a powerful sense of moral purpose in the world for this new level of global engagement. And in this sense, it's William McKinley who's the founding father of the religious influence. I'm sure a lot of you know this very famous story of how he was undecided about what to do with the Philippines in late 1898, and he got down on his knees and prayed to God for guidance in the White House, and God told him to annex, i.e. colonize, the Philippines. But he was then matched by successors such as Franklin Roosevelt, who I would rank alongside George W. Bush as one of the most religious presidents in American history, certainly in American diplomatic history, Harry Truman, Eisenhower, and those usual suspects who I mentioned earlier in my talk. The apogee of this influence, it now seems to me, came actually very recently in the presidency of George W. Bush. In the age of Bush, this was obviously true in a top-down sense from the White House, not just the president himself, but figures like Condoleezza Rice and Stephen Hadley. All through the Bush administration, the religious influence was maybe not predominant, but certainly very prevalent. And this was true even in a place like the Pentagon, in which there weren't a lot of demonstrably religious officials presiding, people like Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz and others who aren't the most spiritual men, but a lot of Pentagon briefings began ritualistically during the Bush presidency with PowerPoint slides that would start with a biblical, with scripture or a biblical verse or some sort of usually Christian but overtly religious invocation. This was also true in a bottom-up sense. We've heard a lot about this already, epitomized in Bush's faith-based politics, which not only recognized but encouraged religious political activism. And this is true in a domestic sense, but it's also true, it's worth repeating, in a foreign policy sense. Bush's foreign policy through and through maybe wasn't guided or driven by religion. I'm not saying that the United States had a certain foreign policy in pursuit of particular religious goals, but religion in a very obvious way, suffused the Bush administration's foreign policy. This bottom-up influence didn't begin with Bush. He didn't create it. He didn't invent it, even though he did encourage it. It's something that really has been consistent all through the 20th century, but surged again in the 1990s, with the most obvious example being this bottom-up pressure that led Congress to pass the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, very much over the protests of the Clinton administration, State Department, that said religion will just interfere with the work that we need to do, with the diplomatic work we need to do in the world. So after a century of more or less continuous influence and engagement with American foreign policy, is the religious influence changing in the age of Obama? And when I said at the beginning of my talk now that I'm basically going to be arguing with myself at the end of my book that was published in 2012, but I finished writing it towards the end of 2010, I argued that no, this isn't changing, and that Barack Obama fits very neatly and very squarely in the tradition of religion informing and shaping American foreign policy. And now I'm not so sure, and that's really what I'd like to use the last part of my talk to discuss. In a top-down sense, there are people in this room who know a lot more about Obama's religion than I do, but I think we'd all agree that Obama himself is a man of faith to a large extent, but it's more ambivalent, it's more intellectual, it's more complex, and it's more searching. I wouldn't say that he's a man of certainty in any sense, although I'm sure he does have certain certainties, but he's a curious, intellectually curious individual, and I think that applies to his religion as much as it does to anything else. And to me, he seems more akin to someone like Jimmy Carter than he does George W. Bush, or even Bill Clinton, for that matter, or Hillary Clinton. Nonetheless, religion featured prominently in Obama's foreign policy in his first term, and in particular in his first 2 years. Most obviously in his Cairo speech of June 2009, which is still, I think most foreign policy experts would agree, the most important speech and the most important initiative that Obama had in foreign policy terms for his entire presidency, so going up to the present. In the Cairo speech, he outlined a faith-based version of democratic peace theory. So normally democratic peace theory says that the more democracies there are, the more chance there is for peace, because democracies are inherently peaceful and don't go to war with one another. That last part is, I think, more or less right. I'm not so sure about the first part, that democracies are inherently more peaceful, given what's happened in the last dozen years or so. And it struck me, listening to Allison's paper, of the sort of echoes of FDR and the New Deal, that there were certain echoes of FDR in Obama's Cairo speech. Essentially, his 2009 speech in Cairo was an iteration of Franklin Roosevelt's 1939 State of the Union address on the world crisis, in which he said that religious freedom is the foundation of democracy, which in turn is the foundation of international peace, or what he called international goodwill. Obama, channeling FDR, said that religion was the foundation for the democratic peace, because in religious societies, such as the United States or those in the Middle East, tolerance and pluralism were necessary for democracy, and in turn to peace, both domestic and international. There are other instances of religion in Obama's foreign policy, again, mostly from his first 2 years. The other most famous example, which I don't have time to go into, is his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in Oslo, which a lot of commentators nicknamed the good neighbor policy instead of the good neighbor policy, because of his debt, his intellectual debt, and I would say his spiritual debt to Reinhold Niebuhr. But as time went on, the religious presence in American foreign policy began to fade, and eventually, I would say, all but disappear. And the ambivalence of the Oslo speech, I would say, is indicative of Obama's overall ambivalence, certainly when it came to the application of religious principles to American foreign policy. It's in the Oslo speech where he it's nicknamed the good neighbor policy, because this is where he used Christian realism as a way to justify the waging of the war on terror. This is where he says Martin Luther King and Gandhi wouldn't have had an answer to Hitler or bin Laden, and sometimes we have to wage war in order to pursue a greater justice. Now, however, religion's role in U.S. foreign policy is basically limited to Islam is the familiar mantra, Islam is a religion of peace, not terror. This is something that Obama has repeated in various guises quite a few times since he became president, including very recently, but it's a formula that was devised by George W. Bush in the wake of 9/11. And after Hillary Clinton's departure, she gave a lot of encouragement to the notion of international freedom and how the State Department would pursue religious freedom internationally. After Hillary Clinton left, it's hard to think of another high-level national security official in the Obama administration who has deployed religion. The bottom-up aspect of religion in U.S. foreign policy is also changing. It's changing in ways that other people who have already presented and are going to present are discussing and analyzing in ways much deeper and more profoundly than I am. But some of the obvious ways in which this bottom-up pressure are changing are thanks to things like demographic change, the rise of secularism and the nuns, and greater religious diversity. Although after listening to Kevin's paper, I'm less certain about that greater religious diversity. And I was furiously typing notes trying to fix what I was saying here based on what Kevin was saying about the myth of contemporary American religious diversity. But I'd say it's the appearance, or at least the acceptance of this diversity, that is certainly changing how religion is used in a political sense, and that obviously applies to foreign policy. Not only does this remove a great deal of pressure from below, it increasingly makes it unprofitable for politicians to use religion before domestic audiences to build consensus for their policies. And that's how most presidents have used religion in American foreign policy. Religion is now too controversial, too divisive to be of political use beyond platitudes about pluralism and tolerance. Religion used to be consensual, but now, as I said, it's divisive. And this is also the case internationally, where American power is ebbing relative to that of other nation states that aren't Christian or Judeo-Christian or Islam or even religious in any meaningful sense. If all this is changing, and if the change is structural and enduring, rather than related to Obama in particular, and thus temporary, I would argue it will significantly change the terms of America's ideological engagement with the rest of the world. Thanks.
So we have some time for questions, but before that, I'd like to have another round of applause for all these very intriguing panels about current events. And there are people with microphones, I believe. So if you raise your hand if you have a question, right there.
Yeah, it's going to change to what? But let me follow it up with a more specific question. So I take it what you're saying is the use, there we go, of explicit symbols and texts from religion is being diminished, even Niebuhrian things being diminished in the second half of the Obama administration. What's it replaced by? Is it pure pragmatism? What then comes in its place? And can we not always see those things as religious in a way?
That's a great question. What's it going to change to? I mean, I don't know. I'm an historian. I'm not very good at predicting what's going to happen in the future. I proved that. I proved my incompetence in forecasting already. I'm probably going to prove it again. Sorry, Matt and Darren, with the chapter in this book. But I mean, I don't mean to be glib. I really don't know. What I would, the last part of your question, I think, is actually what I would answer with, that it's going to be replaced not with pure pragmatism, because I don't think that's possible in a democracy. You can't have a foreign policy without justifying it to people, even in very imperfect democracies. You have to be able to explain it and justify it. And I think what might happen in the American context is that this overtly Christian, Judeo-Christian, or religious, whatever we want to call it, influence is going to be replaced by a broader sort of moralism that, as you hinted at the end of your question, has obvious religious roots, but may not be couched in overtly religious terms. And I can think of the foreign policy of the country where I live right now, Great Britain, which is as moralistic now as America's foreign policy is. And in some cases, certainly Libya in 2010, at first Syria last year, is more moralistic than that of the United States, but not in religious terms at all, in a sort of obvious keyword sense, but in a deeper meaning it very well might. But I would say in the United States that moralism will continue to have some kind of religious impetus or religious shape, even if it's not explicitly couched as religion or Christian or whatever. I'm kind of tying myself in knots now, but I think I'll end there.
Yes, also for Kevin. I mean, Andrew, sorry. I was thinking about your comment about Kevin.
You can ask Kevin,
yeah.
I don't mind. He probably has a better answer than I do. So.
Yeah, I'm wondering, among 20th century presidents, can you think of someone for whom religion could not be translated almost 100% into morality, who had some additional or transcendent notion beyond morality? And then I would wonder that same question from the bottom up.
Wow, so I thought you were going to, at first I thought you were asking if I could think of 20th century U.S. presidents for whom religion wasn't really a source for their foreign policy, either in moral terms or pragmatic terms, and the answer is yes, there are quite a few of them. Those for whom religion was not a source of morality, I mean, then you start, it's a great question, I will answer it, but you start getting into imponderables that no historian or scholar is able to answer with any kind of finality or even definition, to give firm definition to it. From the top down, I would certainly, the first person I thought of was JFK, and I think that's, again, so religion was absolutely not a part of the Kennedy administration's foreign policy. In fact, the Kennedy administration very explicitly tried to sideline foreign policy when it created things like the Peace Corps. The obvious thing if you create the Peace Corps is you've already got a large Peace Corps that's been operating for over a century called missionaries. And the Kennedy administration said we want to have as little to do with missionaries or faith-based NGOs like Catholic Relief Services. This is really a government arm that's going to be secular, and we're not going to be promoting or even dealing with American religion, even if we have to deal with foreign religions when we're in places like Africa. But I get your question is not that, it's how it informed his or any other president's sense of morality.
I'm just wondering if there's any religion operative, either in number 1 or number 2 of your division, that is not itself collapsible into morality or moralism.
It's a great question. Again, it's a difficult one. It's a highly you're talking about an abstraction that is difficult to think of in terms of foreign policy terms. So no, off the top of my head, no, I would say I can't.
I have a question for Allison, and I thought that was a fascinating discussion of Memphis in the 20s when things were bad and the social safety net arrived and things were better. And now we're in 2014 and we're going back to the arguments from the 20s, and I want you to tell me how this happened. For a simple question.
This paper made me go to the present, which I don't actually do a lot of. I stop in the 40s. But I think that part of the explanation is in the blending of church and state that happened beginning in the 1950s that I sort of referenced briefly, the way in which religious organizations became administrators of state aid, and in that sense developed this confidence that they actually could do this and could regain the moral authority they thought they'd lost in the New Deal, and in the process kind of forgot that they had done it really badly before. So they sort of won both contests there.
I have a question for Mark. Since Andrew wimped out and wouldn't put on his prognosticator cap, I'd like you to, if you would, tell us, if you would, what you think the impact of changing demographics are going to have over time, which we heard so much about in the run-up to this election, and certainly after the last election, but didn't necessarily seem to play out in terms of shifting the political map from red to blue, or at least to purple. How is that going to play out on these issues, especially in Texas and Southern politics? Is there going to be a change of demographics that might change the tone or tenor of the culture war in terms of how religion plays a part in the construction of curriculums?
You know, on that specific issue, right, curricular content, Board of Education politics, I think it's going to continue to be very bad in terms of conflict-ridden for another 20 years, because what I see this tension. There have been two papers at both poles of pluralism, success, we've heard some of today, and resistance to pluralism, we've heard some of today. We've heard both, and we're going to continue to see that tension, I think, at the state board level. I think this strong emphasis on American identity as quintessentially Christian. When we're polite, we'll call it Judeo-Christian. But what we mean is Christian is going to continue to be very influential in Board of Education politics, as well as great uncertainty about the other, particularly Islam, and I don't see that going away. And yet, at the same time, even while you have a conservative board being worried about Islam, they are willing to broaden their understanding of religion to include Sikhism, right? Pluralism, success. So you bounce back and forth. I think it is the changing religious and perhaps more importantly in this regard, ethnic demographics that's giving rise to this. It's the white establishment recognizing that it's not going to be the majority in a few years. And until we see that flip, I think we'll continue to have a strong reaction against multiculturalism in any form. Eventually, those demographics will express themselves in who gets elected, and that will affect what actually ends up in curriculum. But boy, I think the debates are going to continue to be very heated for a while.
I'd like to, first of all, thank Kathleen and Mark for trying to introduce some scholarship to this discussion with the Texas Board of Education in regards to their arm wrestle between religion and politics. Thank you very much. It's something that has outraged me personally, but you're in there actually doing it. My question for you, Mark, is you talked about kind of a 99-year look back at standards. Is it possible that there wasn't a lot of reference to religious standards historically because, in fact, the Bible was a textbook in the classroom in decades prior?
Thank you for the question and also for the kind comments about the education work. I want to be careful how I talk about public education because I think it's certainly the case that there is an assumed shared Protestant Christianity that permeates state educational documents. So if we're going to refer to religion in a document, we're going to refer to the church as the unit of religion, for example. And so we don't get inclusive in that regard until just the past few decades. So that was always going on. But in Texas, at least, and I look just at state documents, although the Bible was read a few verses every day in many Texas classrooms, it was never universal practice in the 20th century. And although there were definitely Bible courses beginning in the 19-teens, to my great surprise, Bible courses never really took off in Texas. So the Bible was not as much of a classroom presence for curricular material here as it might have been in some states, at least in the 20th century, is I guess my thought of that. There just wasn't that much religion emphasized in the state documents. And America was assumed to be a Christian nation, yes, but we didn't have Moses as the first American. Right, we didn't have that emphasis on teaching specific historical claims about exactly how we got to this point with those direct lines from the Ten Commandments to the Mayflower Compact, et cetera, at least not in the state documents. So it just highlights how important those issues are to certain constituencies right now. We are at the peak, in some respects, of treatment of religion in Texas social studies documents, at least, which is not necessarily the same thing as classrooms. Thank you.
I have a question for Jennifer, too, and maybe it's pushing all you 19th century historians into the 21st century. But I thought it was fascinating the kind of patronizing attitude towards women and children and other ethnicities that our foreign policy seems to invoke so frequently. And I wondered whether having female secretaries of states made any difference whatsoever.
I'd have to look very closely at things that at Hillary Clinton's record because I don't know as much. Laura Bush actually made a lot of statements about women. It was much easier to find materials, so I didn't look so much about Hillary Clinton. But my guess would be, just from her wider work, is that she might have pushed education, the issue of education, in a way that might actually parallel what some women in Afghanistan are actually calling for. I mean, this to me was one of the most interesting parts of this this research, was that many things that were assumed about what Muslim women would want, they often had to do with kind of Western notions of beauty and vocation, whereas many advocates we have coming out of Afghanistan for women and girls talk about education. And so in that sense, I wouldn't be surprised if Hillary Clinton really was a little bit more in line with things that Afghani women say that they want, which is for their girls to go to school. But I'd have to confirm that with the sources. I don't think, my guess would be that Hillary Clinton would not talk about nail polish.
Can I don't know, this doesn't answer the question, but just off the top of my head, thinking about it, the three female secretaries of state we've had, Madeleine Albright, Condi Rice, and Hillary Clinton, have all three of them been unusually religious when it comes to secretaries of state, who are usually not particularly religious, accepting people like John Foster Dulles. So I don't have any, I mean, I'm not sure how that fits in, but it just occurred to me right now that the three of them have been very open, much more open than you would normally get from the nation's top diplomat. And I don't know if that has a relationship with this.
Interesting point.
Thanks for a great panel. My question's for Allison, and it's just sort of a nerdy fill-in-the-blank history question, which is this. You made a comment and then went over it really quickly about how when social services, when religious institutions can no longer afford to pay for social services and the federal government comes over. And then you talked a little bit about some of the changing dynamics that happen within churches. Like all of a sudden lower class people don't need to go to the middle class church because they don't need them for basic human sustenance. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what happens to the churches once they're no longer seen as providers of material succor. And thinking in context of the Great Religious Depression, you know, as it's called historiographically.
Well, let me start with the end first. The Great Religious Depression was a great religious concern at this particular moment, and much more a concern than a reality that I can find at all. But what happens to the churches sort of depends on the church. So a lot of churches found ways to work around the New Deal. There was still plenty left for them to do, and the institutions that they had built and that they had maintained for so long still stood, and most of them didn't. The New Deal didn't overlap with them at all. So a lot of churches, those that were those whose clergy and whose members were happy to embrace the New Deal and who felt in part that they could take credit for it, they kept at that work. And they did so happily, and they also took credit for the expansion of that work in the New Deal. On the flip side, of the churches, for the most part, the churches that hadn't done much of that work to begin with and didn't really want it to be done anyway, became critics of the New Deal, and that sort of became their thing. And so there are actually not very many of them in this part of the Deep South where I look, which is one of the reasons I look there, because people sort of think that there would be, but there aren't. But they do start to emerge, especially in Arkansas, in the late 30s, and that becomes their thing. They become evangelical critics of the New Deal. They say that this expansion of services has, in fact, taken away the authority that they had to take care of people. In reality, the people who went to which church changed very little, because those middle-class churches were kind of lousy at actually helping the poor anyway, and wanted them to go to church, but maybe not theirs. Oh yeah, sure. But those, so there were the very wealthiest churches tended to be in the opponents category, and the very poorest churches tend to be very divided, whereas the middle-class churches were a little more in favor of the New Deal.
We should probably end this session. Thank you all for your questions and contributions, and the contributions of our excellent panelists. Thank you.
I'm going to open my
I should take out
right to your question.
Yeah, I didn't know how long you were.
I'm just, no worries, I'm
yeah.